Thank you for joining us today. I'm Lauren Kuby. I'm with the Global Institute of Sustainability and Innovation at ASU. And it's my honor to introduce our moderator, Danny Prasad. Danny is our student events coordinator here at the Global Institute of Sustainability Innovation and the Global Futures Laboratory. And she's a junior majoring in sustainability. She is specifically interested in how urban heat island disproportionately impacts underserved communities in Arizona. As a junior, she hosts her own podcast on the urban heat island where she features both academic and heat experts. Danny, take it away.
Thank you, Lauren. I'm delighted to welcome our panelists, Ginger, Mark, and David today. As chair of the Commission's Urban Heat Island and Tree and Shade Subcommittee and leader of Valley Leadership's Tree and Shade Impact Team, Ginger Torres spearheads initiatives to expand the city's shade capacity, reduce the urban heat island phenomenon, and advocates for heat relief projects to be implemented in an equitable manner. She was born on the Navajo Nation in Tuba City, raised in Mesa, and is a passionate advocate for issues affecting Native American communities throughout Arizona. Mark Stapp is a well-known Phoenix area real estate expert, advisor, and developer with experience in sustainable development. He teaches future real estate leaders at Carey School of Business at Arizona State University. And David Hondula, director of the Office of Heat Response and Mitigation for the City of Phoenix and associate professor for the ASU School of Urban Planning, also joins the panel with his extensive background in Arizona heat preparedness and mitigation. Today, Ginger, Mark, and David will discuss how policymakers and developers can use heat mitigation policies to mitigate the urban heat island effect and protect underserved communities. Before we begin, a reminder to all of you, the audience, please enter your questions into the Q&A feature at any time, and Lauren will feed them to me, and we'll get to as many questions as possible. Ginger, please take it away. Oh, you're still on mute.
Hi, Danny. Thank you so much for the invitation to be here, to you and Lauren. I really appreciate it, and I'm prepared to talk about citizen involvement in heat readiness and tree and shade initiatives in the city of Phoenix. A lot of my involvement comes from serving as the commissioner for the city of Phoenix, and also for the chair of the subcommittee for Urban Heat Islands, Tree and Shade. And so what I've been doing is leading this subcommittee to kind of spearhead, evaluate, analyze, and recommend policies with inclusion of the broad public sector and community and stakeholder input to address the issues surrounding urban heat island, trees and shade. And this is all for the whole purpose of mitigating, managing, and adapting to rising heat in the city of Phoenix, creating a more heat-ready and resilient city, and increasing the economic and environmental safety, equity, and health outcomes of the city, and advancing the city of Phoenix's tree and shade master plan, and just overall creating a sustainable mechanism for tracking, value calculation, and public reporting of all of the above. And so that's kind of like the marching orders that our subcommittee for Urban Heat Island, Trees and Shade has been given by the Environmental Quality and Sustainability Commission. And so just overall, with rising temperatures in our city, it's so important that we address heat issues to enhance shade for pedestrians and all those that are in the most heat vulnerable areas in our municipalities first and very quickly. And so what our citizen subcommittees are doing are working to explore ways with city staff, with our elected officials, to address the impacts of rising heat and really try to find ways to add more trees throughout the city via projects like cool corridors and through creating creative partnerships with nonprofit organizations and community organizations. And so in the past few years, this community and citizen input has been integral to facilitating city adoption of policies and initiatives that aim to make our communities and environment more resilient to extreme heat and expand shade cover. Since it is working with cities, sometimes it doesn't happen as quickly as would, the average person would really want to react to things, but the city has a whole requirement of going through kind of like their public engagement processes, the staff development of policies. And so once our citizen subcommittee recommends something, it kind of goes to city council takes it back to the staff level, staff develops either the plan or the policy that comes back to review at the citizen subcommissions and all other stakeholder groups as well. And then eventually it can be approved by city council again and implemented as the official policy. And so sometimes a lot of this stuff takes kind of years of development, but it's all the more reason to work quickly now, especially with regard to some of these very important heat issues that our communities are experiencing on the ground. And so I just wanted to go over a few of the initiatives that our subcommittee has worked on, because I feel like people on this call might be interested to see how kind of what gets recommended can actually evolve into something substantial. So one of the areas that our subcommittee worked on back in 2019, before I was chair, the subcommittee provided recommendations to the EQSC, which were also modified and then sent on to city council by EQSC. And those recommendations were regarding the implementation of the 2010 Tree and Shade Master Plan. And so some of the key recommendations from 2019 from the subcommittee were to establish a full-time citizen stakeholder committee to support ongoing work related to trees and shade and urban heat island issues within the city of Phoenix, hiring a full-time tree administrator for the city of Phoenix, a staff position that would kind of oversee all things trees related. They recommended that this Phoenix City Council invest in a multi-decade commitment for funding tree plantings and programs within the city of Phoenix. And the fourth main recommendation was adopting text amendments that will create canopy and shade from development from the start of a project through the entire lifespan. And so I'll talk about how some of those key recommendations have been implemented so far and kind of what the status of those are. So with the full-time citizen stakeholder committee, we're still, I've been leading that. So that was recommended in 2019. I've been leading that through today. And the future of that citizen stakeholder committee is currently being worked through the city of Phoenix on how that governance will work out, but it is still highly recommended by the Urban Heat Island Tree and Shade Subcommittee. For funding for the full-time staff member, the UHITS and EQSC provided earlier this year, before the City of Phoenix budget process, our groups provided a business case for the creation of this staff position. And this resulted in the City of Phoenix funding $500,000 in this year's budget for the creation of a whole new Office of Heat Response and Mitigation. And the key parts of our business case policy recommendation was it included an evaluation of the benefits to persuade stakeholders within the city council as to the importance of this role within the city. So like the city functions of the position, the economic benefits of hiring somebody in this position with the city, how it would affect the health of our communities and our people, and kind of the effects of overall carbon on our city, reducing carbon. And so then it also included a job description of the position itself and an estimate of the city budget requirements for that as well. So providing all of this data from the subcommittee, this is all citizen driven. And so providing this data to the city manager's office, city council members, I think really justified being able to create this position. And so it made the decision within the city very easy, because everything was very clearly laid out, all of the benefits of hiring somebody in this particular position. So I consider that a success, because not only did we get the tree manager position funded, but we got three or four very other key positions funded within the city of Phoenix this year. And a lot of it, I think, was sparked by this business case that circulated around the city administrators. So another one I want to talk about is zoning code updates. So in June of this year, the Phoenix Planning and Development Department approved a final landscape text amendment, and these text amendments were supported by EQSC with additional language also recommended to protect tree zones. And these, a lot of the participation on our subcommittee was kind of going back and forth with the planning department, and a lot of our members also participated on their own time to reach out to planning department and put in their own thoughts and really advocate. And we had some very dedicated members of UHITS kind of advocating on their own to get language that was very important to protect trees in these text amendments that were approved this year. And so overall, the text amendments really strengthen the existing ordinances, and they codify the best practices for keeping trees as infrastructure and identifying that trees provide benefits when they are appropriately planted, and that trees should be kept in place throughout the life of projects. And these text amendments apply to commercial, industrial, and multifamily and single family subdivisions, but not individual homeowners. I can talk more about that if there are questions, but I'll go on to the next one. And one of our next key issues that the UHITS and EQSC have been involved in is recommending to the city policy areas for development of a cool corridors program. So the streets department in the city of Phoenix has embarked on a cool corridors program, which is very kind of a new idea of just trying to designate certain streets as cool corridors, which would mean that there would be city plantings within the right of ways in order to shade walkable areas within the city. And so what UHITS and EQSC recommended is that this concept of cool corridors be taken beyond the streets department, but kind of as a citywide concept where it would develop the whole program, a program of cool corridors that could be a really wide network, not just, there's a lot of streets in Phoenix that don't have enough right of way width that is owned by the city. So it would take other creative types of partnerships and grant programs within the city that are managed by other departments rather than just the streets department alone. And so this the recommendations really that came out of our subcommittee were to kind of ask the city to think about expanding the cool corridors program to kind of a citywide multi-department program that would include neighborhood services, also the streets department, environmental operations, parks department, to really identify the very best and most useful corridor segments that would really help the most heat vulnerable communities where there are a significant amount of pedestrians. And so, the recommendations involved asking the city to really clearly define what they mean by cool corridors, because there's a lot of conflicting there's a lot of varying, I guess, definitions for what it could be. We asked the city to prioritize heat vulnerable communities and high pedestrian activity street segments first. So really steering those corridor developments, those investments of funding from our public funding to areas where there are people that are walking and that will be exposed to the heat the most. And then providing robust and broad stakeholder engagement opportunities for staff, researchers, and advocacy groups, but also reaching out to neighborhood leaders directly, and also really trying to find that on the ground input in these corridor selection processes. And so other areas that I know, Danny, can you give me an idea of how much more time I have? Because there's so much I can talk about.
Yeah, absolutely. You have about a minute left.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you. And so other areas that our subcommittee has been involved in is we we reviewed the heat resilience chapter of the City of Phoenix Climate Action Plan that was approved in October of this year. And one of the key takeaways from our involvement in the Climate Action Plan was that initially the draft Climate Action Plan proposed by the city proposed 30 cool corridor segments by 2030. And we were able to get that increase to 100 cool corridor segments in vulnerable communities by 2030. And so it's with kind of this close eye to kind of knowing what is going on in the city and really like evaluating, seeing if it makes sense based on city investments, where we want to take our city, and providing that voice at key moments when public and stakeholder input is being welcomed by the city and can be incorporated into future changes. And so that was a really, I feel like significant win there to get that the number of cool corridors increased from 30 to 100 in the final plan. So Valley leadership, I did want to, let me finish with the UHITS and EQSC. So additional work that the subcommittee is working on is we're currently drafting a cool roof policy recommendations for cool rooftops. So that will be coming out within the next month. And we're also working on drafting a citywide heat equity policy by the end of December as well. Future work that we haven't been able to get to that we really have been wanting to add, but our just workload is kind of too much right now, is we want to evaluate additional planning and zoning recommendations for low impact development and green infrastructure areas. And just really quickly before I end, I just wanted to touch on what I'm doing with Valley Leadership and our Trees and Shade Impact team. So our Valley Leadership team that I lead has advocated during the public comment process for the City of Phoenix budget. So mostly supporting a lot of the work that UHITS is doing and EQSC is doing, but just providing an additional stakeholder, I guess, advocacy road to support all of these programs. So we are also working directly with community leaders and the Phoenix City staff, connecting both of them together to direct cool corridor investments to heat vulnerable areas in South Phoenix that we feel should be supported. We're also participating in region-wide initiatives such as the Urban Forestry Roundtable and also other upcoming regional resiliency initiatives with other municipalities. So thank you, Danny.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ginger. And before we do move on to Mark, we have one short question for you from an audience member. And they want to know, will plants used for shade be only native species?
So that is that is a recommendation. So we haven't, I don't think we've submitted recommendations for specific species within these. They're a little bit more high level, but in all of them, I think there is a recommendation to take into account water usage and the appropriateness of the right tree, right place, as it said. And so a lot of those right tree, right places are native species. And so I would say that is a priority within the city. And David probably can talk to more of that when he speaks.
Great, thank you so much. And now I'll hand it off to Mark.
Thank you, Danny and Ginger. So I don't have an extensive presentation. I come at this from a very, I would call it applied, quote, clinical approach to things. And the most important part of this, I think, has been done, which is creating the policy. And the policy, if written properly and is fully supported, is then going to provide the framework. But what needs to happen, and this becomes really complex when you're trying to implement anything in an existing urban area. It's easy when you've got a greenfield development and you're going to apply a certain set of standards to something that doesn't yet exist. But when you are dealing with areas that you may consider to be vulnerable, and part of the cool corridors where they have many of the elements that make up the place already existing, it becomes a little bit more difficult. So implementing the policy, is going to involve understanding finance, design, installation, and operation and maintenance of whatever is done. And it's not clear when you're dealing with areas where there's existing infrastructure and existing ownership versus areas where someone is now asking permission to develop something new. And you can then begin to apply, for instance, the zoning standards or building standards that would have to be complied with. So I think that some of this is going to still have to be flushed out. I know when the climate action plan came out, I was contacted by a couple of the industry advocacy groups. I'm not going to say who they were, but several of them were very concerned about the fact that this is going to impose additional regulatory constraint in cost. And this is really from I know some of the questions that we want to answer are about how do we get landlords or how do we get development participants to participate in this. And it's hard, and you're going to get pushback anytime that you're looking to increase the cost or reduce the capacity or development potential, or you're going to take longer to have something happen. You're going to get significant pushback. And I know that there are the industry groups, the commercial, office, industrial, multifamily, and single family organizations that are looking at these policies very carefully. But one of the things that I would hope begins to happen is an understanding of how you implement this without exacerbating an already important critical issue, which is affordability. So I know that some of the multifamily organizations are concerned about additional cost related to the climate action plan and the fact that it's going to make development more expensive, which is just going to make the affordability problem that we're now wrestling with that much worse. Now, I think some of this is perception versus reality when you get down to actually implementing it, but that's just a case in point. So, I think we need to begin to frame some of the dialogue around actual implementation strategies that recognize some of these constraints that exist, and understanding that there are 4 possible participants in implementation. One of them is public, the other is private, the third is not-for-profits, and the fourth is what I would call special purpose entities that can be created to implement strategy. And most of what I think we're talking about is implementation of a policy within either current or what would be future public space. And that's where it really starts to get tricky, both in terms of the practicality of implementing, the cost of implementing, and the financing, who's going to pay for it. This is, these are my thoughts around the applied thinking, and I'd like to be able to discuss some of this with the other panel members as we continue this dialogue on the call. So that's the extent of my thinking about this at the moment. I know there's going to be a lot of difficulty implementing a comprehensive, cohesive strategy in an environment that is inherently fractured. And therein lies, I think, part of the problem that Ginger and her group will have, and David is going to have, as they try to push some of this now defined policy forward.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Mark. And now we can hand it off to David.
Yeah, thanks so much, Danny, and great to hear from Ginger and Mark. And just to pick up right where Mark left off, I really feel that tension. Our office recently reviewed a zoning adjustment case, and there was a sacrifice of some landscaping and setbacks proposed, which I believe were to try to create an additional unit on a parcel to help affordable housing efforts, to help with the pinch that we all see in the community. And wearing the hat of heat officer for the city, of course, sacrificing landscape would not be desirable from a heat mitigation perspective, but that's just one of many variables in this constellation of difficult decisions to make. And I think as our office gets its feet under it, figuring out how to participate in that conversation without significantly exacerbating some of these other challenges will be an important function for us. So Mark, I imagine we'll have a little more conversation about this once we get into the Q&A, but to introduce myself in the office to everyone, hello, Dave Hondula from City of Phoenix and ASU, and yeah, really grateful for the invitation to be here. I wanted to spend just a couple of moments hitting on 2.5 to 3 different topics. One, I wanted to share what the Office of Heat Response and Mitigation is and how we are trying to get oriented and getting to work. Second, I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the Heat Ready Cities work that's been happening at ASU and some partner initiatives. And along the way, we'll talk a little bit about some community engagement work that we will try to build on as the Office of Heat Response and Mitigation gets going. As Ginger alluded to, there was a $2.8 million commitment in the City of Phoenix annual budget this year for climate and heat readiness. And that investment included 14 new positions across 3 departments, one of which is the new Office of Heat Response and Mitigation. Other positions, for example, included a new crew for tree planting in the Parks Department. I believe that was 5 positions. The budget also includes money for infrastructure and maintenance, including the trees for the Cool Corridor program that Ginger referred to. And importantly, the budget had the foresight to include additional costs per tree to account for some of the infrastructure challenges in getting trees in places in the city where we may not have water lines right now, or where the shape and form of the right-of-way may not be suitable for tree planting. In those locations, we may need to spend more money per tree to get a tree in the ground there. And the budget had the foresight to include that additional investment. And there's also money in this climate and heat readiness budget to update the city's tree inventory. In terms of the Office of Heat Response and Mitigation, once we are all fully staffed, we'll have 4 positions. In addition to the director and administrative assistant, who both exist already, we will have the urban tree program manager, and that job is being recruited right now. I dropped a link in the chat and encourage you and ask you to please share or consider applying yourself. We'll also have another position that is imagined to be some sort of built environment specialist. In my head, the working name for this position is a cool buildings program manager. This person would be thinking about materials, gray, hard materials used both outside and inside to try to help keep the city and occupants of buildings cooler during the summer months. We presented a vision to City Council in October with 8 principles to orient what our office would be working on. And of course, we are continuing to understand what our focus could, should, and can be as we meet with department heads and learn the priorities all across City Council. Just to highlight a couple of those principles, our office is envisioned to have a dual and equal focus on both heat response, which we interpret to mean protecting people when it is hot. This related initiatives include cooling centers and water distribution. And then the second half of our work is on urban heat mitigation, the conversation we're really having today so far, thinking about zoning, trees, the materials used in our landscape, cool corridors. We've heard that it's priority from multiple city councilors to really work on communicating costs and benefits of some of these investments. And I see that Lauren has added a similar idea in the chat already. Some of that work will fall on our office. And there's an exciting presentation coming up in about a month. I think we're starting to see the flyers being circulated. The Nature Conservancy locally has commissioned a study to understand the economic impacts of heat and air pollution in our area. So be on the lookout for that invitation. Maybe if somebody can find it and drop it in the chat, that would be fantastic as well. Our office is absolutely charged with and enthusiastic to advance heat equity. Ginger alluded to, and many of us are familiar with the vast contrasts that exist across the city and in our region with respect to land cover, tree canopy cover, economic impacts, health outcomes. That has to be the centering point for our work if we're going to make meaningful progress on reducing some of the statistics that we're all concerned about. And we also need to be very responsive to community needs and guidance. But that does not mean, in my opinion, that does not mean starting from scratch. As we shared with City Council, we literally have decades of surveys, reports, social media comments, public input that we can build from to understand where to start doing work, where to do more work, where work is needed. And I think a real highlight of that previous community engagement that we can take and run with is the Nature's Cooling System project that the Nature Conservancy spearheaded locally. I'm dropping a link in the chat that has some of the materials that emerged from that process. This was a multi-year effort in partnership with community-based organizations into neighborhoods in Phoenix and one in Mesa. And as you'll see in some of these materials, produced very detailed maps and narratives about the experience of heat in these different communities and what residents understand will make their life better when it comes to having a cooler and more comfortable city. Certainly looking forward to talking more about the office and welcoming input. To shift gears for just another 2 or 3 minutes until Danny gives me the signal. Separate but relatedly, the City of Phoenix and ASU have both been thinking about the term in the title for today's meeting, heat ready cities, and trying to think about what that means. The city, long before it had a heat office, would often get a phone call that had along the lines of, hey, I'm one of your colleagues from another city. What are you all doing for heat and what should we be doing? And that's an interesting, I mean, it's an important question and not one that there is a clearly articulated answer for. We took a lot of inspiration from a program that the National Weather Service operates called Storm Ready. And to this date, the Storm Ready program has certified more than 3,000 communities all across the United States, cities, universities, counties, large gathering spaces, as being prepared to handle emergency weather events when they occur. And we've envisioned a similar type of program that could certify cities as heat ready. And we've conducted a number of interviews, had many workshops with city staff and other folks, and started to build out the skeleton of what such a program might look like. We have a couple of pilot tests and prototypes of what we've envisioned as the tier 1 application to the heat ready program in progress as we speak. We think there are 3 important buckets of activities that cities really need to be thinking about. Of course, the 2 that are in the title for our office, heat mitigation and heat response, but really understanding what's happening inside City Hall, the mechanisms of City Hall, what are the roles and responsibilities. Of course, Phoenix made a very explicit and tangible commitment to define those roles and responsibilities, but we don't see that as we look in most other cities around the country. And we think in the absence of dedicated leadership, meaningful progress on heat is going to be difficult to achieve. My colleague, Melissa Guardaro, who I'm sure is on the line here or will be listening in, said it very well in Scientific American a couple of years ago that everybody's concerned about heat, but it's nobody's responsibility. And we need to build in more of that responsibility in more places. So Danny, I think I'll take a breath there and get ready to transition into the Q&A. As folks are thinking about discussion points in Q&A, I will remind us all that there are potentially some big opportunities coming in the near future for heat mitigation with ARPA money. Having read the Treasury guidance for ARPA money, there are certainly opportunities that are connected to our conversation. And then as you know, what's coming down the road with infrastructure money and potential Build Back Better money, I think there might be once in a generation or more or longer opportunities here that can really help move our heat mitigation story. Looking forward to our conversation moving forward.
Thank you so much, David. And I just want to remind everyone to start submitting questions if you have any. And I will start us off with the question I have for our panelists. I'm interested to know how we can encourage landlords to adopt certain heat mitigation strategies, given that there are affordability concerns, while also keeping in mind the social justice perspective.
So I'd have to ask a follow-up question to that, which is, landlords is a pretty big category. And I think the question is which landlords, and we're talking about landlords of commercial property, landlords of multifamily property. What are we expecting of them? So the first thing I think is clearly define an equally applied set of policies that recognize a reality, which is an existing building owner has got a completely different perspective and maybe ability to accomplish things than somebody who hasn't yet constructed something and is asking to do so. So the design is not there, the conditions don't exist, and they don't have to go modify their conditions. So it's when I said earlier in my comments that this is very fractured, where you've got existing owners and they have property rights, and we have a very strong property rights mentality in the state. It's hard to get some of these things implemented on existing properties without. So having said all that, I think what needs to go, there's, a lot of this policy work, there's two approaches to it. There's either the stick or the carrot. And there, in this particular case, existing landlords, you're going to have to find a carrot. And so incentives work considerably better than do constraints, even with new build. So the question is, what can we define as an appropriate incentive to get the landlord to participate and support a policy? And I don't know what that is, right? Because cities have very little in the way of offering, right? So even if you look at your property tax, so 80-90% of your property tax goes to school districts. Very little of your property tax goes to a city. So we have financing mechanisms like GPLETs or GIPLETs. That's really just focused on the city component. And in this case, could you use it for that? Possibly. Is there another? So there's, if you're collecting, for instance, rental tax, would you be able to say, listen, we'll collect the rental tax, but we're going to allow you to take a portion of it and apply it to implementing a strategy here or an element? So it's really the city who's financing it, asking the developer to implement it. So that's partially, I think, a solution.
Hey, Danny, can I chime in on this?
Yes, absolutely.
So in developing our cool roofs policy recommendations, we actually invited some developers to come and participate in our policy brainstorming session. And out of those conversations, it sounded like kind of similar to what Mark was saying. They were very much in favor of the incentive-based approach rather than the regulatory approach. And specifically, they felt incentives in the area of preferential permitting would be very valuable to them. So any way to speed up the review and possible approval of their projects through the whole citywide review process might be something that they would consider as a benefit. And also non-financial incentives, such as kind of increasing some of their floor area ratio bonuses to kind of meeting criteria for cool rooftops, that type of thing. And so those are two areas that we are considering recommending to the city, but that decision has not yet been made by the UHIT subcommittee.
Yeah, if I could add something to that, Jinder. So for new developments, absolutely those things are great. So existing buildings, a little bit tougher. Developers hate uncertainty and they hate delay, because literally the saying time is money. When you have construction loans, when you have investors and you're paying relatively high rates of return on invested capital, the faster you can go, the better. The more certain the outcome, the better. It reduces risk. So I think those are really desirable incentives for the development community for new build, or when you're doing adaptive reuse or redevelopment of existing properties.
And then with regard to the existing properties, I think for single family residential properties, I think the goal overall should be to reduce, the urban heat, or the heat exposure, which could result in illness or deaths for community members, in my opinion. And so the types of programs that could be attractive, I'm just thinking off the top of my head, to landlords might be something like weatherization programs, or, rooftop retrofit programs that would enable them to put a cool roof, or tree shade programs that kind of are, I don't know if there's low maintenance trees out there, but landlords are also very, cost conscious as well. And a lot of times we're seeing that landlords don't want to plant trees because then they're going to have to take care of them. And so kind of dealing with those like social aspects. But I'd like to hear what David says to this question as well.
Oh, I think I like the term that Mark used about fractured. I think already we've identified about 20 different circumstances that each need to be contemplated differently. Just to give our listeners some encouragement that there has been a productive conversation along these lines. I've learned just in the first 5 or 6 weeks of working with the city that our neighborhood services department has really made a lot of progress over the past few years in working with landlords in cases where air conditioning units malfunction in the summer or fail. And that, of course, can be a life or death situation. And while I don't think anyone would admit that every case has been successfully intervened in yet, the number of complaints that they are receiving each year has gone way down, and that they've been proactively working with landlords where older buildings exist and where they know problems have been, to try to prevent that situation from happening in the first place. So thinking about, Ginger, your comment in the residential sector, what we can do, I think thinking about that air conditioning infrastructure is important. I'd really love to hear Mark's thoughts on the commercial sector. I think many of the folks are on the line all the time, drive past big box store ABC, and the landscaping that exists today has really drifted from what was in the original landscaping plan. And while I'm certainly understanding of the upsides of incentives versus regulations, I'm all for carrots. I think the city may have a stick it could use when landscaping today is no longer aligned with what was in the original plan. How we are starting that conversation is to look carefully at the city's 500 to 600 some facilities to be sure that we are compliant with whatever reasonable landscaping expectations might be before we start asking others, or at least simultaneously as we start asking others. But Mark, what do you think about as we've lost the original landscaping and not replaced it? Is that an intervention point in your opinion?
Oh, absolutely. And this is common, right? We all struggle in this business to get our permits, get our certificate of occupancy, and start using the facilities for what we intended. And then what happens is time goes by, right? The original thoughts, the original plans go away. In fact, many times you can't find the original set of approved plans unless you're going back to the city to look for the permit set. You end up leaving it up to a landscape crew that you're hiring that's a third party, and a tree falls in a storm and it's just easier not to replant it. That happens all the time. So, David, I think the enforcement of already applied requirements is absolutely low-hanging fruit. And the investment in ownership world should have zero complaint, other than they don't want to pay, right? So they'll complain. But I also like the fact that you're saying the city is going to look around and go, listen, just don't do what we want you to do, what we say, not what we do. And so leadership requires that we start by doing exactly what we want you to do. So yeah, I agree with both of those. So let me add one more thing to that, David. You have ownership and you have property management. And they sometimes are two different things. So you have an owner and then you have a property management company that may be third party. And there's many times a disconnect on occasion from those two. So I think also engaging in this building owners and property managers associations to be able to begin educating them. So you've got BOMA, Business Owners and Managers Association, in related entities, the property managers associations, I think are good organizations to reach out to and say, hey, listen, this is something that we're going to start enforcing. You need to know it for your owner's sake and for your community's sake.
Great.
I wanted to jump in and ask you, Mark, how would we specifically start educating these property manager associations, and what would that enforcement look like that you were referring to?
So the educational part, I think, is easy because the organizations exist and they all have local chapters. So it's just a matter of identifying them, reaching out to them, and they are usually ready, willing, and able to learn and be a facilitator of the knowledge transfer to their membership. That's what they're there for. So I think that's one place you start. The other is the compliance component. It's going to require the city is not just the city employing City of Phoenix, but they're going to have somebody who's going to go look at and enforce. It's like any other neighborhood services or code enforcement. So we have code enforcement for setbacks. We have code enforcement for cleaning up your yard. We have code enforcement for lots of different things. If we emphasize code enforcement for the landscaping as part of this, I think you can go a long way to filling some of these missing teeth that are in the space that you're trying to affect.
Danny, I know you got some other questions queued up for us, but I just wanted to draw attention to, as Mark caught himself and said cities and not just city. One, I appreciated taking a little bit of pressure off of Phoenix on its own, but also he speaks to a much needed regional conversation that doesn't have a very explicit home right now. And there is a local leadership to try to figure that out. Braden Kay from Tempe in particular has been moving that conversation forward with Vitalist and some other partners, but how we can bring together all of the cities to think about some level of consistency and what our shared goals are on these exact topics, that nobody owns that right now. And in the absence of a home for that conversation, I'm nervous that we'll just be flying blindly a little bit, or maybe even accidentally competing or conflicting with one another.
So I'm interested, Ginger, to that point, David. Absolutely, right? There's the possibility that a lot of celebration around creating this, and it just doesn't have the efficacy we hoped. Is this something that we need to reach out to MAG and say, hey, can we convene a dialogue? Should we have a regional policy about this and begin wrapping everybody into the dialogue, because they're the convener with all of these local jurisdictions. I've advocated this from the standpoint of a lack of a comprehensive housing policy, right? But the same applies here, is you need a regional policy to really have the intended impact you want.
I agree, Mark. That's something that I would advocate for. I feel like it would be in the wheelhouse of MAG. I think there's some funding issues with MAG as to why they're not taking up this role. So I've been reaching out with Valley leadership directly to Braden to get engaged in the region-wide conversations, because the issues don't just stop at one municipality versus another. And if we want to protect communities within our regional area, it's going to take a lot of cooperation and collaboration between various stakeholders within all of our county lands, but with the overarching goal of protecting our most heat vulnerable areas. So those aren't restrained to one specific municipality. So I think that's very important to get some kind of regional authority governance going on to take on these issues.
Yeah, who are some of the other organizations and regulatory entities that, so this crosses a lot of boundaries, right? So we're talking about social determinants of health in one hand, and we're talking about homelessness in another group, and these are all linked, right? So they have sometimes common sources. And yet so communities are complex organized systems. And what we lack here is the organizational part of that. So we have a lot of systems and it is complex. The thing is, how do we find a nexus and connect these pieces? And so what other organizations should we bring into this dialogue?
From a historical perspective, the county health department had been functioning as the convener of the regional dialogue they had led our efforts to understand who's getting sick and dying from heat. They were really the loudest voice and had convened the initial conversation and brought in some partners to help us understand what might be possible, including the Institute for Sustainable Communities. But county health quickly recognized they do not have all of the functionality that would be necessary, in particular with respect to some regulatory elements for development, right? That's just not at least currently, is not a county health department function. So I think that they are at the right scale, arguably. The functionality isn't quite there.
It's interesting though, because when I'm going to develop something, especially land development, I've got a county health certificate. I've got to get approval from, right? So,
it is interesting.
How many places touch this process that should be included in the dialogue? And I haven't thought of it in those terms yet, but I would be curious how many different of the organizations are required for somebody to get an approval so that we ensure that we have a comprehensive approach to this.
It's challenging.
Sounds like a research project for a student.
It does, Ginger. It is a perfect one. Danny, you're probably already busy, but it is actually a really good research question for somebody.
Yes, and there are a few comments in the chat. Someone suggests that if regional, maybe recommend low water use plants and tie in residential water usage limits at the same time. I know Dallas finds residents that go over. What are your thoughts on this?
I can say, and I have had some great conversations with the city's chief sustainability officer, Mark Hartman, recently about this. What we've heard over and over again is that communities are seeking more trees, but are concerned about the costs of water and maintenance, and in some cases, the costs to remove existing dead trees in the landscape that would block new development. With the certain tree species, particularly some native species, the water use that's required on a residential property to maintain one or two trees is probably in the single digits of dollars per year, maybe less. We're not talking about a significant volume of water. So I think there's some sort of education and learning we all have, and how we can be smart in our watering approach there. Obviously, we have regional concerns about water use in general, but we don't need to, it's my understanding that we don't need to be using a lot of water to keep trees green. And I think the education is about having a good irrigation progress, rather, there's no reason we need to be using too much.
And Danny, I think there's also like an equity issue here too as well. Many parts of the city that are the most heat vulnerable vulnerable on the map also lack access to really cheap irrigated water, which is more prevalent in the more affluent areas of the city. And so I think just being very conscious of that when we're making decisions is something that will help address that equity issue.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Ginger, because many times those who are most vulnerable are living in if they're living someplace and are not homeless, they're living someplace that doesn't have the benefit of newer, very efficient systems. And sometimes they're really inefficient. Sometimes they don't have running water, but you have to be careful of the unintended consequences of some of this. So if you set limits and say, we're going to penalize you, first of all, I can't imagine in the political environment, although you said Texas does this, in the political environment that we exist in, that we're going to find political leadership that says, yeah, let's go ahead and start fining people who use too much water. That's still, I think, a tough pill to swallow. But at some point you have to create that stick and you have to draw a line and say, listen, we're going to have to adapt to this. And the region has not found itself doing that. The reason our per capita water consumption has gone down has nothing to do with our concern for conservation. It has to do with the fact we simply take agricultural land out of production in order to accommodate our growth, right? That's the single biggest factor for reducing our per capita water consumption. It doesn't do anything for the heat island, however.
I'll share on this topic of watering trees. I have found myself asking the question, and it's not meant to imply that there are any plans in the works for any such program, but cities provide services to individual households like trash collection. Is there a world in which tree watering is a service provided by a city? Like, how would that even work? I'm sure there are 1,000 reasons it wouldn't work or couldn't work, and maybe there are a couple of, but I think that's, and I see Mark's face, right? He's I think got the 1,000 bad and the 1 good maybe right now, but like I think it's at least worth exploring a little bit how, what service delivery might look like other than asking private homeowners or renters to have their own irrigation system, which can be very costly and difficult to maintain. So perhaps for another topic for another day.
Yeah, but technology helps solve some. So this is a purely practical problem, frankly. It's a purely practical problem. So individual properties, their water use is measured at the water meter, which is at the property line. And so you take your water into a line that feeds your private property, and that same water line is then diverted for an irrigation system. And question is, can you set something up to measure that? And through technology, you can actually.
Absolutely.
And you would say, okay, I'll tell you what, whatever you have paid for that, we will discount that on your water bill. That's actually an algorithm that's pretty easy to create. Now, the water meter technology becomes the issue. But I think, there's a way to do that, David.
And of course, we're not many years off from having tree watering drones flying around, a whole fleet of them that are taking care of this problem in an automated fashion for us.
You just don't want to be walking underneath them with their little bucket when it's windy out, because you're going to get wet.
And thanks, Lauren, for the info there in the chat.
I know we could continue this discussion, but it is 12 o'clock. I want to welcome any other last minute questions from our audience. But if not, I do want to thank David, Mark, and Ginger so much for your time and having this great dialogue today.
Yeah, thank you everybody for allowing me to participate, and Ginger and David, hopefully we can continue the dialogue within ASU. And
yeah, I was afraid we wouldn't be able to fill up the time, but wow, we can keep going for a whole nother session, Danny.
Yeah.
Very good. Thank you so much for the invitation.
I just want to jump in as Lauren just to thank Danny. She is such a wonderful student at the School of Sustainability, and this was her idea to curate and lead this event. And I'm just personally very proud of her.
Thank you so much, Lauren. I really appreciate that.
So our ASU students at their best.
Thanks, Danny.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Everybody have a
Have a
good day.
great day.